Mrs. Devereaux, you look absolutely radiant. A portly gentleman with a diamond stick pin bowed slightly. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm so glad you could make it. My voice was smooth, modulated, the voice Alexander had helped me cultivate. The voice of a woman who belonged here, among the city's elite. A waiter offered a tray of champagne flutes. I took one, the cool glass a welcome contrast to the warmth of the room. Alexander's hand brushed my lower back, a brief, possessive touch. He didn't say anything, but his eyes, dark and intense, spoke volumes. Mine, that's what they said. I surveyed the room, taking in the swirling silks and tailored tuxedos, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and old money. And then I saw them. Faces from a life I thought I'd buried. Faces that brought a chill despite the warmth of the room. Across the ballroom, near the towering floral arrangement that cost more than my old apartment, stood Christopher. Christopher Windsor, my ex-fiancé, the man who had stood at the altar, not with me, but with her. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, his once charming smile now strained and tired. He was staring at me, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked dangerously like regret. Eleanor? His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the din of the crowd, but I heard it. I felt it, a cold prickle on my skin. I turned towards him, my smile unwavering. It's Mrs. Devereaux, I corrected, my voice cool and even. I believe you know my husband, Alexander. Alexander moved forward, his presence filling the space between us. He didn't offer his hand, didn't even acknowledge Christopher's outstretched one. Christopher, he said, his voice a low rumble, a subtle warning. Good to see you. Enjoying the evening? Christopher stammered, his eyes darting between Alexander and me. I just... He trailed off, unable to meet my gaze. The confident golden boy I'd once loved was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man, and then I saw her. Vivian, my sister, clinging to Christopher's arm like a vine, her smile bright and brittle, her eyes burning with a mixture of triumph and barely concealed fury. The dress she wore was a pale imitation of the one she'd stolen, the one that should have been mine. The life she had should have been mine. A wave of satisfaction, sharp and bittersweet, washed over me. It was a small victory seeing them like this, seeing the cracks in their carefully constructed facade. But beneath the satisfaction, a flicker of something else stirred. A sadness, a ghost of the girl I used to be, the girl who had believed in love and family and happily ever afters. A ghost I thought I'd laid to rest, but one that it seemed still lingered in the shadows of this opulent ballroom. The ghost of a bride who never was. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was Mrs. Devereaux, and tonight the ghost would have to wait. The music swelled, a waltz that tugged at some forgotten memory. I allowed Alexander to lead me onto the dance floor, his hand firm on my waist. He moved with a power and grace that was both captivating and slightly intimidating. Around us, other couples swirled, but all eyes I knew were on us. They're staring, Alexander murmured, his breath warm against my ear. Let them stare, I replied, my voice a little tighter than I intended. I continued to scan the room, even as I moved to the rhythm of the music. The whispers followed me, a low hum beneath the polite conversation. Can you believe it? Eleanor Windsor married to Alexander Devereaux? She looks incredible. I heard she was dead. The last comment sent a shiver down my spine. In a way, they were right, that Eleanor Windsor was dead, buried under the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. Later, I excused myself from Alexander's side, ostensibly to check on the catering arrangements. In reality, I needed a moment to breathe, to gather my composure. I found myself near a small group of society matrons, their conversation easily overheard. Such a tragic story, her engagement ending like that. Poor girl disappeared completely. And now, married to Devereaux? It's like something out of a novel. I moved closer, pretending to admire a painting on the wall. A society columnist, Mrs. Patterson, a woman known for her sharp wit and even sharper pen, caught my eye. She smiled knowingly. Mrs. Devereaux, she said, her voice smooth as silk. You're the talk of the town, you know. Am I? I replied, feigning surprise. I can't imagine why. Oh, come now, she chuckled. A whirlwind romance, a surprise wedding, a stunning bride. It's all very intriguing. And of course, the circumstances of your previous engagement. This was my chance. A carefully placed word here, a subtle suggestion there. It was unfortunate, I said, my voice carefully neutral. A painful chapter in my life, one I'd rather not dwell on. But I'm very happy now. Alexander has given me a new life, a new beginning. A new beginning indeed, Mrs. Patterson murmured, her eyes gleaming with journalistic curiosity. A remarkable transformation, wouldn't you say? Life is full of surprises, I said, offering her a small, enigmatic smile. As I moved away, I saw them. My parents, standing near the entrance, looking lost and uncomfortable amidst the glittering crowd. My mother, dressed in a gown that was clearly meant to impress, but somehow missed the mark. My father, his shoulders slumped, his gaze avoiding mine. I approached them slowly, steeling myself for the encounter. Eleanor, my mother said, her voice strained. You look, well. Thank you, mother, I replied, my tone polite but distant. My father cleared his throat. Devereaux, a powerful man. Indeed, I said, a hint of steel entering my voice. He's a good husband. I let my gaze drift towards the far side of the room where Vivian was still clinging to Christopher, her smile now looking decidedly forced. A tense silence hung in the air. The unspoken words, the accusations, the betrayals, all of it swirled between us, a toxic cloud. Just then, Alexander appeared at my side, his arm sliding possessively around my waist. He nodded curtly to my parents, his expression unreadable. Is everything all right, my dear? He asked, his voice smooth and solicitous. Everything is perfect, I replied, meeting his gaze. I saw Vivian approaching, her eyes narrowed, a determined glint in them. She was clearly intent on confronting me, on saying something, anything, to disrupt the carefully constructed image I had presented. But before she could reach us, Alexander intervened. With a subtle but unmistakable gesture, he steered her away, his words polite but firm, leaving her sputtering and frustrated. He didn't even acknowledge her presence, dismissing her as easily as one might swat a fly. The power in that simple gesture was undeniable. It sent a clear message to everyone in the room, especially to Vivian. I was under Alexander's protection now, untouchable. As the evening wore on, I felt a growing sense of control, of power. But beneath it all, a profound sense of isolation lingered. I was surrounded by people, by admiration, by envy. But I was still, in a way, alone with the ghosts of my past, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the real battle had only just begun. The city lights sprawled beneath us, a glittering tapestry woven across the darkness. The sounds of the gala, the music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, were a distant hum, replaced by the quiet intimacy of our penthouse apartment. I kicked off my heels, the plush carpet a welcome relief to my aching feet. The adrenaline that had carried me through the evening, through the smiles and the stares and the veiled confrontations, was finally ebbing away, leaving me feeling strangely hollow. I moved towards the vanity, the large mirror reflecting my image back at me. Mrs. Alexander Devereaux. The gown, a masterpiece of silk and lace, still clung to me, a symbol of my new life, my new power. But beneath the shimmering fabric, I felt the ghost of Eleanor Windsor stirring. Alexander was watching me from the doorway, his tie loosened, his jacket slung over a chair. He hadn't said much since we left the gala, but his silence was never empty. It was the silence of a predator, observing, calculating. And tonight, I was the object of his scrutiny. You were magnificent tonight, he said, his voice low and smooth, the words echoing in the stillness of the room. I began to unpin my hair, the elaborate updo slowly collapsing into loose waves around my shoulders. Thank you, I replied, my voice sounding tired even to my own ears. It was necessary. He moved closer, standing behind me, his reflection appearing in the mirror alongside mine. His dark eyes met mine, seeing past the carefully constructed facade, past the practiced smile, past the Devereaux veneer. Necessary? He questioned, a hint of amusement in his tone. Or satisfying. I turned to face him, the silk of my gown rustling softly. Perhaps a bit of both, I admitted, a faint smile playing on my lips. But the smile didn't reach my eyes. He reached out and gently touched a strand of my hair, his fingers lingering on my skin. You carry it well, the power, the attention. It's a role, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One I'm still learning to play. He studied me for a moment, his gaze intense. And what lies beneath the role, Eleanor? The use of my old name, spoken in his deep voice, sent a shiver through me. It was a reminder of who I had been, of what I had lost. And it was a reminder that Alexander, for all his power and control, didn't truly know me, not yet. They took everything from me, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The carefully constructed dam I'd built around my emotions was beginning to crack. My family, my future, my name. Alexander's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. And now you have a new name. A better one. I turned back to the mirror, staring at my reflection. It's not about the name, Alexander, I said, my voice shaking slightly. It's about. I struggled to find the words, to articulate the complex tangle of emotions that churned inside me. Grief, anger, betrayal, the burning desire for justice. It was all there, a raw and aching wound. It's about being erased, about becoming invisible, about having your entire life stolen from you, and everyone acting as if it never happened. He was silent for a long moment, absorbing my words. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. And now you're visible again. The words hung in the air, a statement, not a question. And as I looked at my reflection, a memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the carefully constructed walls of my present. The church. The scent of lilies and roses, heavy and cloying. The murmuring of the guests, a sea of expectant faces. My own heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Then, the walk down the aisle, hidden in the shadows, wanting to see, to make sure it was perfect. And then I saw her, Vivian, my sister, wearing my dress. The white lace, the intricate beading, the flowing train, it was my dress, but it was on her. And Christopher, standing at the altar, his eyes shining with a love that was meant for me, was looking at her. The sound of my own gasp, a choked sob lost in the murmur of the crowd. The feeling of the world tilting on its axis, of reality shattering into a million pieces. My voice screaming his name, a desperate, futile plea. Their faces, turning towards me, expressions ranging from shock to pity to cold indifference. My mother's words cutting through the noise, delivering the final devastating blows. Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. You're not getting married. Vivian is. The memory faded, leaving me trembling and breathless. I gripped the edge of the vanity, my knuckles white. The gala, the dress, Alexander, everything seemed to fade away, leaving me stranded in the wreckage of that day. I closed my eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. I wouldn't cry, not anymore. I had shed enough tears for a lifetime. When I opened my eyes again, Alexander was still there, watching me with that same intense, unwavering gaze. He didn't offer comfort, didn't try to soothe me with empty words. He simply waited. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to regain control. I met my own gaze in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was different now, stronger, harder. The ghost of Eleanor Windsor was still there, a faint shadow in her eyes, but it was fading. And I was determined to bury it, once and for all, to replace it with the woman I had become. Mrs. Alexander Devereux, a woman who would not be erased, a woman who would take back what was hers and more. The cafe was tucked away on a quiet side street, a haven from the bustling city. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the space, a comforting contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I chose a small table in the corner, offering a degree of privacy. I needed it. I was about to see Chloe again. A bell above the door chimed, and I looked up, my heart pounding. There she was. Chloe, my best friend. The only one who had believed me. The only one I'd dared to contact before I disappeared. She hadn't changed much. Her fiery red hair was still pulled back in a messy bun. Her freckled face still held that familiar expression of mischievous intelligence. But there were lines around her eyes, a subtle weariness that hadn't been there before. The weariness of someone who had carried a burden, a secret for too long. She spotted me and her eyes widened. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Then, a slow smile spread across her face, and she rushed towards me, engulfing me in a hug. "I can't believe it's really you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I thought you were gone." I pulled back, holding her at arm's length, studying her face. "I am gone in a way," I said, my voice a little shaky. "But I'm also back." We sat down, the small table suddenly feeling like a vast expanse between us. The years, the secrets, the betrayal. It all hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. A waitress came and we ordered coffee, the mundane ritual a welcome distraction from the intensity of the moment. "And married to Alexander Devereaux," Chloe said, shaking her head in disbelief once the waitress had left. "That's insane." I took a sip of my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. "It's complicated," I replied, choosing my words carefully. I wasn't ready to reveal everything, not yet. Not even to Chloe. "Complicated how?" She leaned forward, her green eyes searching mine. "Last I heard, you were about to marry Christopher Windsor, and then, poof, you vanished. Your parents said you'd run off, that you'd had a breakdown. Everyone thought." "They thought I was crazy," I finished for her, the bitterness rising in my throat. "Or dead." "And Vivian, she just stepped right into your life," Chloe continued, her voice filled with quiet anger. "Married your fiancé, wore your dress. It was like you never existed." I nodded, the familiar pain twisting in my gut. "Exactly." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. It was time to tell her, at least part of the truth. "I didn't run away, Chloe, not exactly. Something happened. Something impossible. I woke up, a year before the wedding, a second chance." Chloe stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "A second chance? What are you talking about?" I explained as best I could about the rebirth, about waking up in my old body, about remembering everything, about my decision to leave, to disappear, to build a new life, a life where I wouldn't be a victim, about meeting Alexander, about the strategic marriage, about my plan. "Revenge," Chloe breathed, the word hanging in the air between us. "Justice," I corrected. "I'm not doing this for revenge, Chloe. I'm doing it to reclaim what was stolen from me, my dignity, my life." Chloe was silent for a moment, processing everything I'd told her. Then, she reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I always knew something was wrong," she said. "I never believed their story. Vivian was always jealous of you, and Christopher. He was weak." A wave of gratitude washed over me. Chloe's unwavering belief, her loyalty, it was a lifeline in the storm. The memory surfaced, unbidden, a flashback to a conversation we'd had months before the original wedding. We were sitting in my old apartment, surrounded by wedding magazines and fabric swatches. Chloe had been flipping through a magazine, her brow furrowed. "You know," she'd said, her voice hesitant, "I've never really trusted Christopher. He seems too good to be true. And the way he looks at Vivian sometimes." I'd brushed it off then, blinded by love, dismissing her concerns as mere jealousy. But now, the memory was a sharp, painful reminder of how wrong I'd been. "I need your help, Chloe," I said, bringing myself back to the present. "I need information. I need to expose Vivian, to show everyone the truth." Chloe squeezed my hand. "You know I'm in," she said, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "Whatever you need, I've got your back." And in that moment, sitting across from my best friend in that quiet cafe, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The alliance was formed. The game was on. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I threw myself into my role as Mrs. Devereaux, attending social events, hosting dinners, charming the city's elite. But beneath the surface, a different game was being played. Chloe and I worked in tandem, a silent, invisible force. She used her legal skills and her network of contacts to gather information, to dig up dirt, to uncover the secrets that Vivian and Christopher had tried so hard to bury. I used my position and my influence to subtly undermine them, to plant seeds of doubt, to manipulate situations to our advantage. We leaked information to the press, carefully crafted snippets of gossip that painted Vivian as a manipulative social climber and Christopher as a weak, easily swayed fool. We spread rumors, whispers in the right ears that questioned their sudden marriage, that hinted at a darker truth behind their seemingly perfect facade. I made sure to be seen with Alexander at all the right events, my presence a constant reminder of Vivian's stolen life. I was gracious, charming, the perfect wife. But every smile, every gesture, every carefully chosen word was a weapon. Vivian and Christopher's marriage, already strained, began to show visible cracks. I saw it in the way they interacted at social gatherings, the forced smiles, the tense silences, the barely concealed arguments. One evening at a charity auction, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "I made a mistake, Vivian," Christopher said, his voice low and filled with despair. "A terrible mistake." Vivian, her face pale and drawn, hissed back, "Don't you dare say that. We're married. We're happy." Her voice was shrill, bordering on hysterical. But I saw the fear in her eyes. The fear of losing everything she had stolen. I watched them from across the room, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling, piece by piece. Vivian, in her desperation, made several clumsy attempts to get close to Alexander. She tried to engage him in conversation at social events, to flatter him, to insinuate herself into his world. But each time, he rebuffed her, coldly and publicly. He saw through her, saw the desperation and the malice that lurked beneath her carefully constructed mask. He treated her as a simple nuisance. Another memory surfaced, a vivid image of Vivian's subtle sabotage. A dinner party at my parents' house months before the wedding. Christopher had been praising a dish I'd made, a family recipe. Vivian, with a seemingly innocent smile, had said, "Oh, Christopher, you always exaggerate. Eleanor's cooking is adequate, but I make a much better version of that dish." It was a small thing, a seemingly insignificant comment. But it was part of a pattern, a constant chipping away at my confidence, a subtle undermining of my relationship with Christopher. These memories, once painful, now fueled my determination. I wouldn't rest until Vivian's lies were exposed, until everyone saw her for who she truly was. As the weeks passed, I could feel the shift in the social landscape. The whispers grew louder, the doubts more pronounced. Vivian was losing her grip, her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her, and I, the ghost she thought she'd buried, was watching it all unfold, a silent, avenging angel. She was becoming isolated, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, and the walls were closing in. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, illuminating the elegantly set tables. The air buzzed with the polite chatter of the city's elite, gathered for my charity luncheon, a benefit for a cause I genuinely cared about, supporting underprivileged young women. But today the charity was almost secondary. Today was about planting seeds. Seeds of doubt. I had meticulously planned the guest list, ensuring the presence of key individuals. Society columnists, influential bloggers, and most importantly, people who had been close to my family in my previous life. Friends of my parents, former acquaintances of Christopher and Vivian, people who held pieces of the puzzle, who could be swayed, who could help me expose the truth. Duh. I moved through the room, a vision in a pale blue dress that Alexander had insisted I wear, saying it made me look innocent yet powerful. The perfect image for today's performance. I greeted guests, exchanged pleasantries, and subtly steered conversations in the desired direction. "Mrs. Devereaux, this is a lovely event," Mrs. Hawthorne, a woman who had known my mother for years, gushed. "You've done such wonderful work." "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne," I replied, smiling warmly. "It's a cause close to my heart. I believe every young woman deserves a chance to fulfill her potential, regardless of her circumstances." I paused, letting my gaze drift towards a group of women who were whispering and glancing in Vivian's direction. It's a shame, really, that some people are so focused on appearances, on climbing the social ladder, that they forget the importance of genuine kindness and integrity. Mrs. Hawthorne followed my gaze, her eyebrows raising slightly. "Indeed," she murmured. "There are some. Surprising stories circulating these days." I feigned innocence. "Oh, I try not to listen to gossip." Of course," she said, but her eyes were alight with curiosity. "But one can't help but wonder about certain rapid engagements and sudden disappearances. I let the silence hang in the air, a pregnant pause filled with unspoken questions. Then, I offered a small, sad smile. Life is full of unexpected twists and turns, Mrs. Hawthorne. Sometimes, the people we think we know best surprise us. I moved on, leaving her to ponder my words, to connect the dots, to draw her own conclusions. Later, I orchestrated a chance encounter with Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, old friends of my parents, people who had been at my wedding, the one that never was. Eleanor, Mrs. Peterson said, her voice a mixture of surprise and pity. It's it's good to see you. We were so worried. Worried? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Why would you be worried? Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. Well, after everything that happened, your sudden departure, Vivian's wedding. I let a flicker of pain cross my face, just enough to be convincing. It was a difficult time, I said softly. A very difficult time. But I've moved on. I'm happy now. Vivian seemed so happy, Mrs. Peterson said, but her voice lacked conviction. Did she? I asked, my tone light and airy. Appearances can be deceiving, can't they? Sometimes the brightest smiles hide the darkest secrets. I saw the doubt flicker in their eyes, the questions forming behind their carefully polite facades. I had planted the seed. The memory slammed into me, unwanted and visceral. My parents' house, the day after the wedding. The cold, sterile atmosphere. My mother's face set and unforgiving. My father refusing to meet my gaze. Vivian is a better match for Christopher, my mother had said, her voice devoid of emotion. You were always too independent, too headstrong. This is for the best. My pleas, my tears, my desperate attempts to make them understand, all met with cold indifference. We don't want to hear it, Eleanor, my father had said, his voice final. It's over. Go away. The feeling of utter abandonment, of being cast aside by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The memory fueled my resolve. I wouldn't let them get away with it. I wouldn't let Vivian win. Throughout the luncheon, I continued to weave my web, subtly dropping hints, guiding conversations, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone present. I used my charm, my influence, my new position as Mrs. Devereaux to turn the tide, to rewrite the narrative that Vivian had so carefully constructed. By the time the luncheon ended, the air was thick with speculation and suspicion. The whispers had grown louder, the questions more pointed. The tide of public opinion, that fickle and powerful force, was beginning to turn. Vivian's carefully crafted facade was cracking, and I was the one wielding the hammer. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and I knew with a chilling certainty that they would soon bear fruit. The harvest of truth was coming. The silence of Alexander's study was a stark contrast to the social whirlwind I'd just left behind. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the bookshelves and the heavy mahogany desk. Alexander was seated in his leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his gaze fixed on me. You are playing a dangerous game today, Eleanor, he said, his voice low and even. It's a game I intend to win, I replied, my voice firm despite the tremor of exhaustion that ran through me. He swirled the liquid in his glass, watching the light dance on its surface. And what is the prize exactly? It was time. Time to tell him the whole truth, the truth I'd kept hidden, even from him. The truth that haunted my dreams and fueled my every action. I sat down in the chair opposite him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. It's not about a prize, Alexander, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's about justice. It's about reclaiming what was stolen from me. And then I began to tell him. I told him everything. About the wedding that never was, about Vivian's betrayal, about Christopher's weakness, about my parents' cold indifference, about being cast aside, about being erased, about being left to die alone. As I spoke, the memories flooded back, vivid and painful. The flashback consumed me, transporting me back to that final agonizing moment. My empty apartment, the silence deafening, as the pain in my chest, sharp and unbearable. The feeling of my life slipping away, of darkness closing in, the overwhelming sense of grief, of loss, of betrayal. The final desperate thought, They'll get away with it, they'll win. And then, nothingness. I recounted my death to Alexander. When I finished, the silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Alexander's expression was unreadable, his eyes dark and inscrutable. I couldn't tell if he believed me, if he was disgusted, if he was angry. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with a steely resolve. They will pay for what they did to you, Eleanor. I don't want them to just pay, Alexander, and I need your help, I replied. I don't want them dead. I do not want revenge. I need them to see the truth. I want them to know that I did not give up, and I fought for my life. He stood up and walked towards me, his presence filling the room. He reached out and gently cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of my cheekbones. Tell me what to do, he said, his voice a low murmur. Tell me how to help you. And in that moment, looking into his eyes, I knew I had found not just an ally, but something more. Something I hadn't dared to hope for, a partner, a protector, and perhaps, just perhaps, a future. The rooftop terrace overlooked the glittering cityscape, a breathtaking panorama of lights and shadows. A cool breeze swept through the space, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and the distant sounds of the city below. It was the perfect setting for a final act, a dramatic showdown. And tonight, that's exactly what it would be. I had chosen this location carefully. It was secluded enough for privacy, yet public enough to ensure witnesses. Tonight, Vivian's carefully constructed world would come crashing down, and I wanted everyone to see it. I saw her across the terrace, standing near the edge, her back to me. She was wearing a red dress, a bold, defiant color, but her posture was anything but. She looked tense, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I took a deep breath and walked towards her, my heels clicking softly on the stone floor. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence until I was standing right behind her. Vivian, I said, my voice calm and even. She flinched, startled, and turned around. Her eyes, wide and dark, were filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Eleanor, she said, her voice tight. Or should I say Mrs. Devereaux? You stole my life, Vivian, I said, ignoring her attempt at sarcasm. You wore my dress. You married my fiancé. You took everything from me. Her carefully constructed facade began to crack. I did what I had to do, she retorted, her voice rising. You were always the favorite. You had everything. The perfect life, the perfect fiancé, the perfect family. You could have had your own life, your own happiness, I interrupted, my voice cutting through her tirade. But you chose to take mine. You plotted, you schemed, you manipulated everyone around you. You even manipulated me. Her eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The guests I'd carefully invited, key members of society, including our parents and Christopher, were now gathering around us, drawn by the escalating tension. I didn't think you'd disappear, she stammered, a hint of guilt, perhaps even remorse, flickering in her eyes. But it was quickly suppressed, replaced by a renewed surge of defiance. You thought you could erase me, I said, my voice cold and hard. You thought you could step into my life and no one would notice. But you were wrong. I gestured towards Chloe, who was standing nearby, holding a small, unassuming folder. Chloe has been very helpful, I said, my voice dripping with irony. She's helped me gather some interesting information. Emails, phone records, testimonies from people you manipulated, people you lied to, proof of your carefully orchestrated plan. Vivian's face paled. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Chloe stepped forward, her expression grim. She opened the folder and began to read, her voice clear and steady, detailing Vivian's lies, her manipulations, her betrayal. The evidence was irrefutable, damning. The guests gasped, murmured, their eyes darting between Vivian and me. The carefully constructed social order, the polite facade, was shattering, revealing the ugly truth beneath. Christopher, who had been standing silently at the edge of the group, stepped forward, his face ashen. He looked at Vivian, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and despair. Is it true? He whispered. Vivian, is it true? Vivian couldn't meet his gaze. She just stood there trembling, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Our parents, their faces etched with shock and shame, tried to intervene, to defend Vivian, but their words were weak and unconvincing. They too were finally seeing the truth they had so willingly ignored. "It's over, Vivian," I said, my voice soft but firm. "The game is over." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a raw, desperate plea. But there was no forgiveness in my heart. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The days following the confrontation were a blur of activity and emotion. The fallout was swift and brutal. Vivian was ostracized by society, her name becoming synonymous with betrayal and deceit. The whispers that had once followed me now followed her, but these whispers were not of admiration or envy, but of disgust and condemnation. I saw glimpses of her, here and there, a fleeting shadow in the periphery of my new life. Once I saw her walking alone, her head down, her shoulders slumped, the vibrant red dress replaced by drab, unremarkable clothing. She looked broken, and for a moment a flicker of pity stirred within me. But it was quickly extinguished. She had made her choices. She had to live with the consequences. Christopher was lost, adrift in a sea of regret and self-recrimination. He had lost everything: his wife, his reputation, his future. I saw him once, outside a coffee shop, looking gaunt and unshaven, his eyes haunted. He saw me, and for a moment our gazes locked. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, turning away and disappearing into the crowd. My parents, forced to confront their own complicity in their betrayal, reached out to me, tentative and ashamed. They offered apologies, explanations, excuses. But I found it difficult to forgive them. Their betrayal had cut too deep. I accepted their apologies, but the relationship was irrevocably damaged. I met with a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended by Alexander. We discussed legal options, the possibility of reclaiming some of my lost assets, of pursuing legal action against Vivian and Christopher. But it felt hollow. The money, the property, it didn't matter anymore. What I had lost could never be truly regained. "What do you want, Mrs. Devereaux?" the lawyer asked, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Closure," I replied, the word feeling both heavy and empty. "I want to move on." One evening, I found myself thinking about old times, times before the betrayal. A memory surfaced, a brief, fleeting image of a happier time. As Christopher and I, laughing, walking hand in hand along the beach, the sun setting in a blaze of glory. The feeling of his hand in mine, the sound of his laughter, the sense of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a beautiful memory, but it was tainted, poisoned by the knowledge of what was to come. I pushed the memory away, refusing to dwell on the past. I realized that revenge, while satisfying in the moment, was not enough. It had brought me a measure of justice, a sense of vindication, but it hadn't filled the void, hadn't healed the wounds. I needed to build a new life, a life that was truly my own, a life that was not defined by the past, but by the future. I needed to move forward, to embrace the present, to find happiness and fulfillment on my own terms. The ghosts of the past would always be there, a faint shadow in the corners of my mind. But they would no longer control me. I was free. Finally, truly free. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, the city was quiet, the late-night bustle having subsided to a gentle hum. I sat curled up on the sofa, a soft blanket draped over my legs, a book lying open but unread in my lap. My mind was elsewhere, drifting, reflecting. The storm had passed. The reckoning had come. Vivian's life, as she knew it, was over. Christopher was a ghost of his former self, my parents. Well, that was a wound that would likely never fully heal. But the immediate chaos had subsided, leaving behind a strange, unsettling calm. I had achieved my goal. I had reclaimed my power, exposed the truth, achieved a measure of justice. But now a new question loomed. What now? Alexander entered the room, his presence filling the space, grounding me. He had shed his usual formal attire, wearing instead a simple sweater and trousers. He looked softer somehow, less guarded. He sat down beside me on the sofa, not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He didn't speak, didn't intrude on my thoughts. He simply waited, patient and observant, as he always was. "Are you going to be all right?" he asked finally, his voice low and gentle. The question surprised me. It was a question filled with genuine concern, a question that went beyond the strategic alliance, beyond the carefully constructed roles we had played. It was a question that hinted at something deeper. I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the powerful facade, past the Devereaux name, past the calculated moves and the strategic pronouncements. I saw a man who had been, in his own way, as wounded and as guarded as I was. A man who had offered me a lifeline, a chance to rebuild my life. A man who perhaps had begun to care. "Yes," I replied, my voice firm, a newfound conviction ringing in my tone. "I believe I am." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "You've been through a great deal," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I have," I agreed, "but I'm not that woman anymore, Alexander. The woman who was betrayed, the woman who was erased. I'm someone new." "And who is that woman?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I thought for a moment, searching for the right words. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I'm going to find out. I'm going to build a life, a real life, on my own terms. A life that is not defined by revenge, but by purpose, by meaning." He smiled then, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, softening his sharp features. "I believe you will," he said. And in his eyes, I saw not just belief, but something more, admiration, perhaps even affection. We sat in silence for a while longer, the only sound the crackling fire and the gentle rhythm of our breathing. It was a comfortable silence, a shared understanding that transcended words. The strategic alliance was evolving, shifting, becoming something more. And for the first time since I had woken up in the past, I felt a flicker of hope, a sense of genuine possibility. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also open, filled with potential. And I was ready to face it, to embrace it, to forge my own path. Several years later, I stood on the balcony of our home, a sprawling estate overlooking the ocean. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of salt and pine. The sky was beginning to lighten, the darkness slowly giving way to the soft, pearly hues of dawn. I was no longer Mrs. Devereaux, the society wife, the avenging angel. I was simply Elle, a woman who had found her strength, her voice, her purpose. My relationship with Alexander had deepened, evolved into something far beyond a strategic alliance. It was a partnership, a bond built on mutual respect, shared values, and yes, a growing affection that bordered on love. We had found a rhythm, a balance, a way of navigating the world together while still maintaining our individual identities. I was deeply involved in philanthropic work, using my position and influence to support causes I believed in, to empower women, to give back to the community. It was fulfilling, meaningful work, work that gave my life a sense of purpose that went beyond social status or personal gain. I was no longer haunted by the past. The memories were still there, of course, but they had lost their sharp edges, their power to wound. I had found peace not through forgetting, but through acceptance, through forgiveness, through building a life that was so full, so vibrant, that the shadows of the past had no room to linger. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a sense of profound gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance I had been given, for the strength I had found within myself, for the unexpected love and partnership I had discovered with Alexander. This was my new beginning. This was my sunrise. A life built not on revenge or bitterness, but on hope, on resilience, on my own terms. And as I watched the sun climb higher in the sky, I knew with absolute certainty that I was finally truly free.